There were two men, both seriously ill, who occupied the same small hospital room. One man was allowed to sit up on his bed for an hour each afternoon to help drain fluid from his lungs. His bed was next to the room's only window. The other man had to spend all his time flat on his back. Well, the men talked for hours on end, and every afternoon, when the man in the bed could sit up, he would pass the time by describing to his roommate all the things he could see outside the window. The man in the other bed began to live for those 1-hour periods where his world would be broadened and enlivened by all the activity and the color of the outside world as described by the man sitting up looking out his window. I can see a park with a lovely lake, the man sitting up would say as he looked out the window. There are ducks and swans playing on the water while children sailed their model boats. Lovers are walking arm in arm amid flowers of every color of the rainbow. He would continue. Grand old trees graced the landscape, and a fine view of the city skyline could be seen in the distance. And as the man by the window described all this in exquisite detail, the man on the other side of the room would just close his eyes and imagine the picturesque scene. On one occasion, the man described a parade passing by. And although the other man couldn't hear the band, he could see it in his mind's eye as the man by the window portrayed it with descriptive words. One day a thought entered his mind, the man who was not next to the window. Why should he have all the pleasures of seeing everything while I never get to see anything? It didn't seem fair. And as the thought fermented, the man felt ashamed at first, but as the days passed, he missed seeing more sights, and his envy eroded into resentment and soon turned him sour. He should be by that window. And the thought controlled his life. One morning when the nurse came to check on the man by the window, she found him lifeless. He had passed away. And as soon as it seemed appropriate, the other man asked if he could move to the other spot of the deceased by the window. The nurse made the switch and then left him alone. And slowly, painfully, the man propped himself up on one elbow to take his first look out the window. And finally, he would have the joy of seeing it all by himself. And he strained to look out the window beside the bed. He looked out his window, and what did he see? The window faced a blank wall. Didn't see anything. What if you were looking out the window at a blank wall? What would you see? As you look out the window of your own life into your world, what do you see? To what degree is there a connection between what we see and our state of happiness? That's the subject we pick up today in our study in the book of Ecclesiastes. And so I invite you, if you have your Bibles, to turn in them to the book of Ecclesiastes. It's 2 books over from the book of Psalms. You got Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. Now, I chose this study in the book of Ecclesiastes at this time in the life of our church because my hope is that we give ourselves to what really matters in life. My prayer is that we quit searching for who knows what to find happiness, wasting our lives, but that instead we enjoy our journey along the way. And as we saw last week, it is only when God is at the center can we find lasting happiness and fulfillment. It is only as God is in it is life worthwhile, the short time we have here on earth. Now, if there's one thing that I hope you took away with you from last week and really serves as an underlying theme for this entire series. It is this: if God isn't in it, it ain't worth it. If God isn't in it, it ain't worth it. And perhaps that just might become our theme for this year. Who knows? Well, we turn our attention today to the second chapter of Ecclesiastes. And as you can see, I'm working through Ecclesiastes in large chunks at a time. And I hope by doing that, we get a greater sense, a richer sense of the tensions in life that are presented to us in this very honest book. God makes himself known to us through what is written here in this often misunderstood book of the Bible. And while Solomon is the said writer of this book, it is God speaking through Solomon to us. What we have written here is exactly what God intended for us to read today and for us to take it to heart. And so look with me at Ecclesiastes chapter 2. Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 1. Ecclesiastes 2, verse 1, Solomon says, I thought in my heart, or I said to myself, Self, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. Now that word pleasure there means a state of happiness that comes from entertaining our bodies with sensual stimuli. It's the idea of feeling good. Solomon is going to scratch some itches in the pleasure zone. He's going to experiment with some pleasures. Now, why is he doing this? Well, he tells us why in the 3rd verse of chapter 2. He shows us his hand, as he says at the end of verse 3, Ecclesiastes 2, he says, I wanted to see what was worthwhile for men to do under heaven during the few days of their lives. The few days. It really is just a few days. I mean, compared to eternity, life really is short. What are you doing with the few days? What am I doing with the few days that we have here on earth? Is it worthwhile? Well, Solomon's going to test some things we would consider pleasurable to see how worthwhile and fulfilling they really are. And so he has a few tests here. The first test that he turns to is laughter. Laughter. He turns to laughter. He goes to the comedy club. He watches sitcoms. He goes to parties. He tries to amuse himself with things that make him laugh. And his conclusion is that laughter is, verse 2, laughter, I said, is foolish, and what does pleasure accomplish? Now, most of us here would argue that laughter is good. I love to laugh. I like to be around people who also love to laugh. Now, Solomon elsewhere said a cheerful heart is good medicine. And likely, all of us could benefit from a little more laughter in our lives. We sometimes take it just way too serious. Laughter is foolish? Well, it is if we look to dodge the serious issues of our lives. It is foolish to think that we can laugh our troubles away. I mean, can laughter solve your problems? There was this disturbed and troubled man who awoke melancholy every morning, and he went to bed at night deeply depressed. His day was marked by darkness and clouds. He could not find relief for his anxiety. In his desperate condition, he decided to seek the counsel of a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist listened to this man for almost an hour, and then finally the psychiatrist leaned toward his patient and he said to him, you know, I heard that there's this local show at a theater, and I understand a very funny comedian has come into our city. He's leaving people in stitches with laughter. He's getting great reviews from the critics. Maybe he is the one who will bring back your happiness. Why don't you go see this professional comedian and laugh your troubles away? And the patient muttered, Doctor, I am that comedian. Do you hide behind laughter and jokes to deflect the deeper matters of the soul? It is foolish to look to laughter to provide lasting satisfaction, because if God isn't in it, Solomon says, that is not the answer. Well, he moves from laughter to pleasure test number 2, finding happiness in a drink. Finding happiness in a drink. And Solomon says in verse 3, I tried cheering myself with wine. Now, don't picture here a drunk in a dark alley, but rather one who's trying to heighten all his experiences. And Solomon's mind is still being guided by wisdom here, he says in verse 3. This is a controlled, thought-through experiment. He's not smashed. He's not drunk. He's not out of control. No, he is very much in control, and he's looking to alcohol to kind of lift him out of his emptiness, but he wants to stay controlled so he can think rationally about it. He looks to alcohol. Sing me a song, piano man, sing me a song tonight. We're sharing a drink we call loneliness, but it's better than drinking alone. Many people's drug of choice is alcohol to mask the loneliness and pain within the soul. And they only discover that it cannot touch the matters below the waterline, can it? See, the problem isn't the drink any more than the problem is with laughter. It is when we look to those things to satisfy the soul that it becomes an endless, frustrating search that you find yourself just jumping from one fleeting experience after another. The world says life is short, so party on and experience as much of the pleasures of the world as possible. That's what many think make life worthwhile. Just go after it all. There's this man who had a bad cough, and his self-diagnosis was lung cancer. He realizes that his life is short, so he decides he's going to live it up in the time he figures he has left. So he goes out and he takes piano lessons for the first time. He takes cooking classes. He reads lots of books. He hires a personal trainer. He goes to flight school, and he takes in all the entertainment that he can as possible. He denied himself nothing. One day he fills in his wife about his cough, and they diagnosed himself with lung cancer. And she tells him, will you go get a second opinion? So he goes to the doctor, and he finds out it isn't lung cancer at all. It's only allergies. He gives up all the lessons. He gets rid of his personal trainer. He lightens his intake of amusements, and he goes to bed one night very, very troubled. Even more troubled than when he had the thought he was dying. He was disturbed that when he thought that life was short for him, that he did not consider helping others. With his brush of death, he embarked on a mad self-binge. And he turned and he said to his wife, my thought of death only pushed me further into myself. Is your trying circumstance that you might be going through right now just pushing you right into yourself? You're so self-absorbed and just consumed with your own stuff that you can't even think about what it would be to help others and to get outside of yourself. See, we can't even talk about living for what really matters until we come to grips with our raging passion for ourselves. And that becomes clearer really in Solomon's third test. He turns to test number 3, personal projects. Personal projects. So he builds, he makes, he buys, he owns, he works. He's filling out that I will be happy when. I will be happy when I own that summer home. I will be happy when I own that piece of land. I will be happy when I build that bigger church. I'll be happy when I finish that project. That is what will make me happy, truly happy. In verses 4 through 8, we find a phrase that stands out like a sore thumb. 6 times in 5 verses, we find 2 words that will show Solomon's motivation in these personal projects. It's really clear in the original. A lot of the translations kind of miss this phrase showing up 6 times. And so I want to kind of read it like it was really meant to be read here. It reads something like this. You can still follow along. You'll get it here. Verse 4, he says, I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and I planted vineyards for myself. You can count them, there's 2. I made for myself gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. Go down to verse 6. I made for myself reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. Now go down to verse 8. I amassed silver and gold for myself, and the treasure of kings and provinces I acquired for myself, men and women singers, and a harem. Now, by the way, just that word, we're not going to get sidetracked by this, but it can be translated musical instruments. It only shows up here in the Old Testament, nowhere else, so it's really tough to know if that word's harem or musical instruments. It really doesn't matter. Do you get the picture as to who all this is for? Himself. I have to stop and just ask, be honest. Be honest here. The longer hours at work, is it really for yourself? Are you killing yourself with jumping from one project to the next because in them you're looking for some kind of fulfillment that fills the ache inside? Is the building of that ministry for yourself? Is the time spent helping someone else in order to get strokes for yourself? These are tough questions. I'm convicted by them myself. Are you hoping to find some significance or give some inflated impression of yourself by what you own? Are you what you own? Now, we have to say, is it wrong to have a sense of fulfillment in our completed projects? Is it wrong to find some satisfaction in our accomplishments and in our achievements? I mean, is it wrong to build houses or bigger houses? Is it wrong to plant gardens and to have summer homes? I mean, at what point is some personal project or accomplishment wrong or unsatisfying or sinful? Millard Fuller of Habitat for Humanity was addressing 200 pastors at a workshop in Pittsburgh. And the pastors in attendance there had listed the number one reason that the church did not assist others financially was because of greed and selfishness. So Millard then asked this seemingly innocent question to the 200 pastors. He says, is it possible for a person to build a house so large that it's sinful in the eyes of God? He then asked the pastors to raise their hands if they thought so, if they thought it's possible for a person to build a house so large that it's sinful in the eyes of God. And all 200 pastors raised their hands. Okay, said Millard. Then can you tell me at exactly what size, the precise square footage, a certain house becomes sinful to occupy? Complete silence. That's not easy to do with 200 pastors. You could have heard a pin drop. Finally, a quiet voice spoke up from the back of the room. He said, when it's bigger than mine. Right? You see, the size of the house is not the issue. We'd like some preacher, perhaps, to tell us the exact size and square footage that a certain house then becomes sinful. Listen, that's legalism. When does your house or one of your projects or one of my projects become sinful? When it becomes more important than God. When it becomes more important than God. When we start to wrap our significance around some project or accomplishment, we're going to find it does not really satisfy the soul. What makes life worthwhile during the few days here on earth? Well, Solomon tried laughter. He pursued wine. He gave himself to projects. He had all the stuff, and he was indeed the epitome of a pleasure seeker. And he says in verse 10, look at verse 10, I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. Oh, how that describes life in America, right? See, life the American way could be reduced to 5 words. It's only 5 syllables, just 2 sentences, only 19 letters. I've seen it on a bumper sticker, and you probably have too. The 5 words that I think summarize the American way is life is short, Play hard. And boy, are we playing hard. We're playing hard. I mean, if happiness is to be found in the pleasures, then we as a nation ought to be deliriously happy. Are Americans happy? You know, this survey is out, and I'm not going to get into all of it, but right up to 2015, as far as most the countries that are the happiest, America falls around 15. 15. I mean, it's more like Switzerland and Denmark, Norway, and some others. 15. Americans happy. We got all the stuff. Are we finding happiness by entertaining our bodies with one sensual stimuli after another? We have to ask, is that the answer? What is Solomon's conclusion? All these completed projects, he says in verse 11, yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. Solomon denied himself nothing. He accumulated all the stuff. He poured himself into gathering more and more wealth. He worked so hard so he could play hard. And at the end of the day, he's forced to ask for what? What good was it? What was the point of it all? Listen to these words of a despairing man. Verse 17. Verse 17 says, so I hated life, because the work that's done under the sun was grievous to me. All of it is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Verse 18, I hated all the things I had toiled for under the sun, because I must leave them to the one who comes after me. Isn't that true? We can't take it with us. You know the saying, right? What's the saying? Never seen a hearse pull a U-Haul. Stuff. You know, we have a disease. It's called stuffitis. Someone said, for Christians, some of them are going to go up feet first because they're grabbing all the stuff. It's not theologically correct, but it's a good image. I need it. I got to grab it. What's the answer to such desperation? Look, he continues here, verse 19. And who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool, yet who have control over all the work into which I poured my effort and skill under the sun. This too is meaningless. Verse 20. So my heart began to despair over all my toilsome labor under the sun. For man may do his work with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, and then he must leave all he owns to someone who has not worked for it. This too is meaningless and a great misfortune. What does a man get for all the toil and anxious striving with which he labors under the sun? All his days his work is pain and grief. Even at night his mind does not rest. This too is meaningless. Now that's pretty depressing stuff there. That's one despairing man. What's the answer to such desperation? What are we to do with our few days here on earth? Where do we go with all this? What's the final word here about pleasures? Now, the challenge for us from this passage may be different than you would expect. Some preachers' conclusion to this sermon might go something like this. Abstain from pleasures, don't drink, don't engage in worldly entertainment. If it's fun, watch out. I think that misses the point. Some might conclude that what we need are more rules. See, the world says it's happiness by addition. More alcohol, more sex, more comedy shows, more money, more. The church comes along and says, no. It's not happiness by addition. No, that's wrong. It's happiness by subtraction. Don't laugh, don't drink, don't have money, don't have fun. So what happens, and we see with our young people, is that Christians stop bouncing back and forth from living like the world and finding that doesn't really cut it. And then they go back to the church and they find that kind of boring and lifeless and irrelevant and lethargic. And I'll be honest with you, my perception of God as a teenager was that God was this cosmic killjoy. And if he saw that you were having fun, he'd come over and say, no, we're not going to do any of that now. Squash it right out. That was my image of God. Now, it didn't necessarily come from my parents. I just found that whatever it was that the people in the church had, I didn't want it. I since have had a different worldview of the Christian community, obviously. Some of my best times have been with fellow believers, as it should be. We've been touched with the supernatural power of God, and that should bring color to our black and white world. See, we can read what Solomon writes here and we can miss the point, because the goal of all this is not morality. The goal of all this isn't more rules. Listen what Solomon goes on to say here, verse 24. Here's the punchline. Verse 24, he says, a man can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in his work. Now that word, that phrase, find satisfaction, literally means to see, to look, to use our sight. We are to see life with joy. Happiness all comes down to how we see life. Happiness is a choice. And so Solomon goes on, end of verse 24. This too I see from the hand of God, for without him who can eat or find enjoyment. You see, when you look out the window of your life, what do you see? A blank wall? Why is it that you take two people going through similar circumstances and one is carrying on and the other is grumbling and coming apart? It has to do with how they see life. What do you see? Do you see what you have as gifts from his hand? I think it really boils down to this. That's what I think it all boils down to. We search for happiness in the things we don't have. We search for happiness in the things we don't have. What's the secret to finding true happiness? We stop wishing for something we don't have. Listen, your job will go better when you stop wishing for the job you don't have and start thanking God for the one you have. Husbands and wives, your marriage will go much better when you stop secretly wishing for the spouse you don't have and start thanking God for the one you do have. Young person, your day will go much better when you stop wishing for the brains and the beauty and the body and whatever else you may wish you had and start thanking God for how he has made you and what you do have. Followers of Jesus Christ, your church experience will go much better when you stop wishing for the ideal church and start thanking God for the church where God has placed you. Do you see it? What area of your life do you need to stop wishing for something you don't have and start thanking God for what he's given you? And perhaps the reason you're not seeing his blessings is because you're wishing for something you don't have. There's a verse in the New Testament, and I'm going to touch on it briefly, that helps put the pleasures of life into perspective. It's 1 Timothy 6:17. You can go there if you want. I'm going to throw it up on the screen here so you can see it. 1 Timothy 6:17. Very interesting verse. As a young person, I didn't know this was in the Bible. 1 Timothy 6:17, it says, command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain. Now we know that part of the verse. But to put their hope in God. Now get this, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. What? That's in the Bible? You kidding me? He provides us with everything for our enjoyment. What is this saying? Well, at least three things. Don't forget God. Fix your hope on God and enjoy God's gifts. Don't forget God. Fix your hope on God and enjoy God's gifts. Now, would it be too strong for me to say that to not enjoy his gifts is sin? Work that one out. Think on that one a little bit. Earlier in the same book and written to Timothy, God, through Paul, says, for everything God created is good, and nothing's to be rejected if it's received with thanksgiving because it's consecrated by the word of God in prayer. In Psalm 16:11, God speaks of the eternal pleasures that are at his right hand. You know, honestly, we're just too lazy when it comes to the pleasures of God. C.S. Lewis is right. We are far too easily pleased. We're so willing to settle for such pitiful pleasures, we could laugh and we settle for coarse joking. We could live forgiven and we settle for works righteousness. We could enjoy powerful intimacy with our spouse and we settle for the superficial, careless stuff. We could have a feast, we settle for gluttony. We could have a celebration, we settle for drunkenness. We could worship and we settle for religious activities. We simply do not shoot high enough. I agree with Larry Crabb, who aptly said, the core problem with most of us is not that we're too passionate about bad things, but that we're not passionate enough about good things. God calls us to repent of those lesser and trivial pursuits and find our satisfaction in Him. I ask you, on a scale of 1 to 10, how satisfied are you in God? On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 very satisfied, 1 not satisfied at all. Where are you in that? Why is it that our desire for solutions to problems is much stronger than our desire for God? I love what Dan said this morning. We have desires for these other things more than we have panting after the living God. Why is it that we've lost our appetite for the good things God designed us to enjoy? Now, if you walk away from this sermon today with a deeper passion and urgency to know Him and to enjoy Him, then you have connected with this message. If our time in Ecclesiastes drives you to be more passionate about all that is good, all that is found in a relationship with Jesus Christ, then our few moments this morning have indeed been worthwhile. It's only then that you can eat and drink and find satisfaction in all that you do. For the one who pleases God, Ecclesiastes 2:26 tells us God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. Are you living to please Him? If so, He sends gifts your way to be enjoyed. The question is, what do you see? Blank wall or the blessings in life? In his book, Living Life on Purpose, Greg Anderson shares the story of one man's journey to joy. He says his wife had left him and he was completely depressed. He had lost faith in himself and other people and God. He found no joy in living. One rainy morning, this man went to a small neighborhood restaurant for breakfast, and although several people were at this diner, no one was speaking to anyone else. And this miserable, depressed man hunched over the counter, stirring his coffee with a spoon. In one of the small booths along the window was a young mother with a little girl, and they had just been served their food when the little girl broke this sad silence by almost shouting, "Mama, why don't we say our prayers here?" The waitress who had just served their breakfast turned around and said, "Sure, honey, we can pray here. Will you say the prayer for us?" As this waitress turned and looked at the rest of the people in the diner and said, "Bow your heads." And surprisingly, one by one, their heads went down. And this little girl then bowed her head and folded her hands and said, "God is great, God is good, and we thank Him for our food. Amen." The prayer changed the entire atmosphere. People began to talk with one another. The waitress said, "We should do that every morning." And all of a sudden, said this man, my whole frame of mind started to improve. From that little girl's example, he said, I started to thank God for all that I did have and stop majoring in all that I didn't have. I started to choose happiness. What do you see? What do I see? What you have or what you don't have? Will you see life with joy? Will you choose happiness centered in Him? Let's choose that.